Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Deborah Jacobs. I'm the University Librarian and Vice Provost for Library Affairs here at Duke, and a Latin Americanist by training, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you all here. My role, aside from welcoming you, is to tell you a little bit about the history of the Juan Mendez Award. The Juan Mendez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America honors an outstanding book of nonfiction, including graphic works, published in English on human rights, democracy, and social justice in contemporary Latin America. The Juan E. Mendez Book Award for Human Rights in Latin America honors the leadership and legacy of Juan Mendez, a champion of justice who has devoted his life to the defense of human rights. Mendez is the former UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and current professor of human rights law at American University. This award began in 2008 as a collaboration between the Washington Office on Latin America and Duke in recognition of WOLA's decision to deposit its institutional papers in Duke's Rubenstein Rare Book and Manuscript Library. In 2017, Duke collaborated with Juan Mendez to shift the award to be in his honor. Mendez's papers are housed at Duke University Library's Human Rights Archive, one of the largest collections of human rights material at any U.S. university. The papers document Mendez's work as the UN Special Advisor for the Prevention of Genocide and the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, as well as his work with the International Center for Transitional Justice. Mendez is well represented in the ICTJ records themselves, which are also housed at the Human Rights Archive, along with the papers and records of noted human rights activists and organizations such as Rabbi Marshall Meyer, Patricia Darien, Jerome Shestak, Robert Cox, and the Washington Office on Latin America, as mentioned. The Duke Human Rights Center at the Franklin Humanities Institute, the Duke Human Rights Archive at the Rubenstein Library, and Duke Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies are pleased to co-sponsor this event. Thank you.
Hey everybody, welcome. I'm so pleased to have such a great crowd. My name is Robin Kirk. I'm a co-director of the Duke Human Rights Center here at the Franklin Humanities Institute, and I'm one of the judges on this award. I brought my Against Forgetting, which I've had since it was published in 1993. And I wanted to talk about that, as well as the wonderful book that Carolyn has just published, and that is the recipient of this award, What You Have Heard Is True. I was introduced to Carolyn Forché's work when I was a recent college graduate and English major, headed south to become a writer. I went a decade later than Carolyn and a little further south, as the crow flies, to Peru and Colombia. I could have said about myself what Forché writes about herself in her lovely memoir. I was at the time quite young, with a romantic view of the world, and I was also an American, which made this worse. In Latin America, I traveled a similar road and found a lifelong passion not only for writing, but for human rights. Throughout many twists and turns, Forché's work inspired me, warned me, scared me, lifted me, and showed me that a commitment to justice and to art were not incompatible. Indeed, they were deeply entwined. Poets see and feel and hear things perhaps in a different way than others. Words are a bulwark against forgetting, the title of Forché's 1993 anthology. They're also a reminder that whatever humans do and do to each other cannot be excluded from the poet's view, from praise, from justice, or from condemnation. Poets are, as she writes in her introduction, witness to the dark times in which they lived. Forché gave me and so many others permission to be our whole selves as we documented horror, not just the scribe, but the daughter, not just the activist, but the poet, not just the outraged, but also and indelibly the human being who felt and raged at and cried out against the injustice. Forché stands with giants, Akhmatova, Garcia Lorca, Hikmet, Darwish, Alegría, Santiago Vaca, Soyinka. Yet she also has an exquisite and persistent ear and openness for people who would never call themselves or consider themselves poets. You hear that in her poetry, including in The Country Between Us. Those same voices and lives come through with dignity and luminescence in her memoir. What you have heard is true. As Professor James Chappell, my co-judge, wrote about Forché's book, it really made me think about human rights from the inside, full of doubts and hesitations and obfuscations, rather than simple moral righteousness. It's the long and winding journey, which most of us never complete, to the place where, in Forché's words, my life was all of a piece. My heart and intellect and soul were aligned with what I was doing in that world, and the people around me were also living and working in this way. The man who introduced Forché to El Salvador, Leonel Gomez Bides, said to her once, "See as much as you can. Memorize everything." That advice was good for a human rights activist, and it's good for a poet. See as much as you can. Memorize everything. Then tell us so that we know the truth and we cannot forget. Please join me in welcoming Carolyn Forché.
Thank you. I want to thank Duke University and the Human Rights Center, the library, everyone who made this possible, everyone who makes possible the award honoring Juan E. Mendez. It's an incredible privilege to receive an award named for him. I had the honor of meeting him about 8 or 9 years ago at a dinner party we both were at, and I was stunned and struck, and I was next to him, and I didn't know what to say, and finally he drew me out and wanted me to tell him everything about El Salvador. So I'm here, and I'm going to begin with 2 poems, if it's all right, because I started as a poet, and I maybe will end up that way. I have a new poetry book coming out on March 10th. So I'm going to read 2 poems from it to begin, and then I'll tell you a little bit about this story. The first poem, I've spent the last 7 summers on the northern islands in the Aegean in Greece, and they are very close to Lesbos and the islands where the refugees are now encamped and held. In the beginning of those summers, the Greeks with small fishing boats would go out and rescue people from the Zodiacs and from some of the boats that were coming from North Africa. And it became against the law to help migrants at sea. It still is. It was against the law to pull them to shore, to feed them, to house them. In that time, the Greeks didn't care, and they helped anyway. They all disobeyed this law on the island where I was, Thassos. Sometime later, I got to know one of these refugees. He was from Homs in Syria. This is his story. The boatman. We were 31 souls, he said, on the gray sick of sea, in a cold rubber boat, rising and falling in our filth. By morning, this didn't matter. No land was in sight. All were soaked to the bone, living and dead. We could still float, we said, from war to war. What lay behind us but ruins of stone piled on ruins of stone? City called Mother of the Poor, surrounded by fields of cotton and millet. City of jewelers and cloak makers, with the oldest church in Christendom and the sword of Allah. If anyone remains there now, they would be utterly alone. There is a hotel named for it in Rome, 200 meters from the Piazza di Spagna, where you can have breakfast under the portraits of film stars. There, the staff cannot do enough for you. But I am talking nonsense again, as I have since that night we fetched a child, not ours, from the sea, drifting face down in a life vest, its eyes taken by fish or the birds above us. After that, Aleppo went up in smoke, and Raqqa came under a rain of leaflets warning everyone to go. Leave, yes, but go where? We lived through the Americans and Russians, through Americans again, many nights of death from the clouds, mornings surprised to be waking from the sleep of death, still unburied and alive with no safe place. Leave, yes, we'll obey the leaflets, but go where? To the sea to be eaten? To the shores of Europe to be caged? To Camp Misery and Camp Remain here? I ask you then, where? You tell me you are a poet. If so, our destination is the same. I find myself now the boatman driving a taxi at the end of the world. I will see that you arrive safely, my friend. I will get you there. And this I'm dedicating to the Vietnam veterans who came to lunch today, who do the work of bringing the book that was just published about the movement inside the military against the Vietnam War, waging peace, to this campus for an exhibit. It was recently here. I hope you had a chance to see it. I've taken several return trips with veterans in the company of both American veterans and Vietnamese veterans who fought against them in the war. The last trip was a year ago, February. Hue, from a notebook. We went down the Perfume River by dragon boat, as far as the pagoda of the 3 golden Buddhas. Pray here. You can ask for happiness. We light joss sticks, send votives downriver in paper sacks, then have trouble disembarking from the boat. Our bodies disembark, but our souls remain. 1,000 lanterns drift. A notebook opens in the dark to a page where moonlight makes a sound. These soldiers are decades from war now. Pewter-haired, steel-haired, a moon caught in plumeria. We are like clouds that pass and pass. What does it matter if we are not the same as clouds? There was then the whir of stork wings and bicycle chains ringing. It is still now, the way the air is still just before the mine explodes. Once we fired at each other. Now we pass silence back and forth. On the 10,000 graves, we lay chrysanthemum. So now this memoir took me 15 years to write it. Even at my usual book a decade pace, that's a long time. It took me 23 years to start writing it. I had promised Monsignor Romero, the Archbishop of San Salvador, who was assassinated in March 1980, that I would someday write about what happened. I also promised Leonel Gomez that I would do that. And I reached my early 50s, and it began to dawn on me that I was possibly running out of time. So the Ukrainian exiled poet Ilya Kaminsky encouraged me to start. So then it took 15 years. I was 27 years old when this story begins. I had spent the summer with Claribel Alegría, a poet from Central America who was living in exile in Spain at the time. I was her daughter's friend in San Diego, California, and her daughter and I, we cooked up this idea that we were going to translate Claribel Alegría into English for the first time. She had been translated into other languages, but no one had ever translated her into English. I'm not sure why, but most of the translators at the time for contemporary poetry were men, and for some reason, nobody knows why, they tended to translate male poets. So I decided if I was going to translate, I would translate a woman. Claribel became that woman. That summer, I listened in the edge of their circle. Franco was dead. Spain was open. Spain was democratizing. People from the Southern Cone, from the dirty wars in Argentina, Uruguay, Paraguay, Chile, were coming into exile to Spain. No language barrier, a new day for Spanish politics, and many of these writers stayed with Claribel that summer. So I met a good many of them, and every day they would gather to watch the sunset and talk about politics and literature. And they talked about horrible things happening in Central America. Claribel had grown up under 50 years of military dictatorship. I knew nothing about Central America. And so I was listening on the edge of the group, trying to improve my Spanish, trying to grasp everything that was happening. And there was a certain name that would come up. And it was Claribel's cousin. His name was Leonel. He was still in El Salvador. He was a very mysterious man, they said. They said he was a Pan-American motorcycle racing champion. They said he was a world-class marksman, and he had received handmade Kalashnikovs as trophies and things like this. They said he gave some of his land to the campesinos, and he slept on the ground with one of his motorcycles in his arms. They said he was a little bit like Robin Hood, and maybe he's with the guerrillas, but a lot of people think he works for the CIA. So I was really intrigued. This was, for the 27-year-old me, this was fascinating. And every time I asked them to tell me more about him, they would be quiet. They didn't want to say anything else about him. And the only thing they sometimes said to each other was, I hope he lives through this. He is playing a very dangerous game. Flash forward to November. I've joined Amnesty International. I've started to learn a little bit about Central America, and I'm grading acres and acres of freshman composition papers at San Diego State University, where I taught. I'm home alone. I'm grading the papers. I hear a vehicle in my driveway. I think they're turning around. The vehicle turns its engine off. They're not turning around. So I went up to the window upstairs to look down and see who was there. It was an early white SUV called a Hiachi. And a man was getting out of it with a big bag over his shoulder, woven Guatemalan bag, I would find out later, stuffed with papers. And he had a big roll of paper under his arm, and then two little girls jumped out. So I thought, well, that's fine then. Two little girls wouldn't. No, he's okay. He had El Salvador license plates. I didn't put it together yet, who it might be. I just thought, I don't know anybody in El Salvador. And he starts walking past my neighbor's house. He's coming to my house. The doorbell rings. I thought about not answering the door. I'm the oldest of 7 children. My mother used to say, please don't answer the door to someone you don't know when you're home alone, et cetera, et cetera. So I thought, well, he'll go away. He rang again. The little girls were laughing. He rang again, and I realized he probably wasn't going to go away. And I really wanted to know who it was, so I opened the door with the chain on. And he said, you are Carolyn Forché, and I am Leonel Gomez Vides. These are my daughters. So I shut the door, and I went to get the photographs I'd taken that summer. And I said, if you are Leonel Gomez, I want you to tell me who these people are. His own cousins. You know? So he said, oh, yes, this and this. And then I took the chain off, and he said, I like that you checked me out like that. That was very good. And then he marches into my house, sends the girls to play with the 23 rabbits in my backyard that were the offspring of the 3 Easter bunnies my creative writing students had given me that spring. And he tells me to, clear the stuff off the table. We have work to do. He said, I don't have much time. I have to talk to you. So I'm going to give you a little bit of what happened next, because I'm going to read little passages from this. Well, I'll tell you what, before I do that, he covered the table with white paper. He sat down and began talking to me about the conquistadores that conquered the Americas. He begins hundreds of years ago to give me this history that he wants me to know, and he draws everything he says. He makes a drawing. I'd never seen anybody do that before. He had papers and objects scattered all over the table. The first question he asked was, how much do you know about military dictatorship? And I said, nothing. And he said, good, you know that you know nothing. This is a very good beginning. And then he talked for 3 days and 3 nights. By the end, he was drawing American helicopter gunships over some mountains he had drawn. And he was saying, in 3 to 5 years, my country is going to be at war. This war is probably inevitable at this moment, although I'm still trying to stop it. I need, right now, in this moment, a poet. So I'd never heard anybody say anything like that before. And he said, because I need the poet to come to El Salvador right now so the poet can learn everything about the country, all of the facets of life, all of the people, everything that's happening. And then when the war starts, the poet will be in a position to talk about the war in the United States and influence Americans, who will then influence their government in foreign policy decision-making, having to do with how much they will support or not support this war. Well, the first thing I said was, Americans don't consult poets on matters of foreign policy. We're not on CNN. Most Americans don't even think there are any living poets, and couldn't name any if there were. And also they kind of view them as a little bit odd. We're a fringe element in the society. We're sometimes a little crazy, bohemian. I gave him the whole thing. I gave him some of the ways that poets have died and, everything that poets get up to and get into. And I said, so we're not taken seriously. I think you need a journalist. And he said, no, I don't want a journalist. I need somebody who's going to use the language of the heart rather than of the mind and of objective observation. And he said, I need a poet. And I said, well, it's not going to work. And he said, well, you'll just have to change that then. So I thought, okay, yes. And he asked me a lot of other things. He asked me if as a war protester during Vietnam, I understood Vietnam. I said no. And then he asked me a question no one ever had asked me before. He didn't ask me what I had majored in or what anything about, we get asked, what are we going to be when we grow up? He said to me, what plan have you made for what you're going to do for the rest of humanity in your life? What are you going to do? No one had ever asked me that, and I didn't have an answer. And he said, well, I'm giving you an opportunity. Perhaps this will give you a chance to do something for the rest of humanity. And then he was fairly convinced that I was actually going to come in January. And he told me, I'll see you in January. January 4th would be good, And then he packed up his hiachi and he drove away with that Peruvian flute music coming out of it. And I'm yelling, I didn't say I was coming. And then I told everyone about this strange man and his invitation. And everyone said, you can't go to El Salvador. This is crazy. You're going to get malaria. You don't know this guy. Even his own cousin claims not to know him. This is a stupid idea. You're a poet. Go to Paris and write poetry, or at least New England. Go somewhere where they write poetry. And so I kept asking people, and everyone said no, until a college chum of mine came by visiting, and I told him, and he said, "How many people have you asked this?" I said, "Oh, everybody." "And what have they said?" "Oh, they've all said no." So he said, "I think you want to go. I think you're just waiting for one person to think this is a good idea. Let me be that person. I think you should go." So I got on the phone and got my plane ticket arranged. The war that he thought was coming much sooner than he had expected. The death squads were already operating in the cities and throughout the countryside. 2 priests had already been killed, 40 nuns had been deported, 300 campesinos had been killed just before I got there. And so I flew to Ilopango Airport. If you go to Salvador now, you're in a big international airport. Ilopango was a tiny little airport, dark. It was like a shell shape. It was pretty broken down. El Salvador didn't have a whole lot of tourism then, so I found myself late at night alone in Ilopango Airport with my suitcase, and no one was there. Lionel was not there to meet me. And suddenly a man comes through the parking lot and he said, "You're Carolyn Forché?" "I'm John Taylor, Peace Corps. Lionel sent me to pick you up." I was very relieved, but not for the first time did I think it was possibly a mistake to have come. He put me in the truck and he said, "How long have you known Lionel?" And I said, 3 days. And he said, "So you don't know him very well either, do you?" And that was the beginning. Where I was taken that night was Benihana of Tokyo, San Salvador, where he had arranged some kind of meal that he thought would remind me of Vietnam in 1959. He had a real flair for this sort of thing. So he took me all over the country. I met with military officers, with campesinos. I stayed in the countryside. I worked with a lot of people. And he was exasperating, dedicated, brilliant. I fought with him a lot because he would never answer my questions except with experiences. I'm going to read some scenes that occur later in the book. The first one, he asked me to, I was talking about disappeared people. I was trying to get the military officers that I met to tell me what had happened to certain people. And Lionel told me that it wasn't a very good idea to bring up that subject with military officers as directly as I was doing. But he said, if you want to help with human rights, there's a prison in Ahuachapan, where some of you have gone. And it was for men, and there were political prisoners in there. And he said, I've arranged for you to go in the prison. You can stay for about a half an hour, no more. You're going to be visiting someone that you will pretend you knew before, and you will visit him and he will take you around. He's one of the prisoners. And he said, and I think everything will be okay. And I said, you're coming, right? And he said, no, it's better if you go alone. So this was a moment of truth for me. And I went into the prison. This is the scene. The prison had 4 wings and an open courtyard. The hallways on the 4 wings gave onto this yard. So the odors and cook smoke lifted toward the clouds, but the stench still hung, trapped in the air. I put the Fanta orange juice to my nose and Miguel smiled. The men filled the courtyard, lining all 4 wings, squatting on the tiles or sitting with their backs to the wall and their legs outstretched. When I walked through the hall, some of the men pulled their legs in to make way for me, and some didn't. Some had tucked newspapers into the rims of their straw hats, and these hung down over their faces and all around their heads. They tented their heads with newspapers for privacy. They were wearing their own clothes, not prison uniforms, but rags, filthy torn garments pocked with holes. As Miguel walked on his crutch, the prisoners pulled their legs away to let him pass. I walked close to him. "There is where we sleep," he whispered, pointing to a room that appeared to be lined with wooden shelves. "Those are the barracks. This place was built to hold about 200 men, but there are twice that number here now." He stabbed the tile with his crutch and kept moving. "Here are the latrines. Don't go in there." The odd thing was that no one was looking at me. As I approached, they turned their faces away or looked down at the floor or at one another. Only Miguel looked, and it was quiet too. When we were outside in the beginning, I could hear a din of voices and shouts and even laughter coming from inside, but now, nothing. Here are the workrooms. These were long, narrow rooms with wooden benches, the walls made of peeling concrete painted aqua. I didn't see any tools or other evidence of work. We turned a corner where a group of prison guards had gathered in a circle, playing a game with dice, thoroughly occupied with the game, tossing dice and laughing or groaning. No one looked at us. We had made almost a full circle of the courtyard on all four wings. Miguel glanced around cautiously. "Listo," he whispered. "Are you ready?" He locked eyes with me, then asked if I saw the dark, open doorway nearby. I did. It was not quite 10 feet away, a room with an entrance like the barracks, like the workrooms, but it was on the other side of the courtyard, the far side. "No one is paying attention to you now. Just walk into that room and try to see what you can. Don't stay long. And control your face when you come out. I'll be right here. If anyone sees you and asks what you are doing, just make an absent-minded North American lady face." And he imitated such a face by looking at me blankly with his mouth slightly open. I had never seen anyone do that before, and didn't realize that this is what we looked like to others. "And just say you got lost." For a moment I froze, and then he smiled and nodded yes to me, tossing his head in the direction of the doorway. "Go now, quickly." I was inside the room. It was darker than any other room in the prison, and it stank more. I tried to adjust my eyes to the darkness. "Try to see," Lionel had said. It was what he was always asking me to do. "Try to see. Look at the world," he'd say, "and not at the mirror." What I saw were wooden boxes about the size of washing machines, maybe even a little smaller. I counted the boxes. There were 6. And they had small openings cut into the fronts with chicken wire mesh over the openings. They were padlocked. As I stood there, some of the boxes started to wobble a little, and I realized that there were men inside them. Fingers came through one of the mesh openings. Blood rushed to my ears, and I stood trying to orient myself so that I could know not only where the room was, but also which wall the boxes were against. And then I walked slowly toward the light of the open doorway and into the hall where Miguel was standing against his crutch. As I came toward him, he whispered, "Tie your sweater sleeves around your neck. You have hives." I get hives, not as often as I once did, but in childhood frequently. Whenever I was afraid or nervous or sad, they bloomed on my neck and face, so I did as he asked and tied the sweater sleeves. "That's la oscura, the darkness, solitary. Sometimes men are held in there for a year and can't move when they come out because of the atrophy of their muscles. Some of them never recover their minds. Tell them on the outside. Tell them." And then raising his voice, he said, "Carolina, it has been nice to see you again. Give my love to Ana and Carlos." He was walking whispering again, "Mil gracias. It's time now for you to go. Go," he said, motioning with his head toward the gate. "But will you be all right?" "Como no?" he said. "Go." At the entrance, Lionel was waiting, as promised, but beyond him, soldiers had surrounded his hiachi and were looking through the windows. He rested his hand on my shoulder and we began walking side by side. Why are they? I don't know. I guess we're going to find out. So I had a friend named Margarita Herrera. I hope some of you will meet her if you go to El Salvador with the group. But we became really close friends. In the beginning, she didn't like me because I was a North American. And she said, "You are just using the country as a laboratory." And I said, no, I'm just trying to do what Lionel brought me here to do. Anyway, a lot of things happened and we became bonded. And she would give me clothes to wear because I only had, jeans and T-shirts and things. And she wanted me to look bourgeois. Everybody there who could afford to look bourgeois wanted to look bourgeois so that when we were arrested or killed, we would be bourgeois, It was just something that people felt would be a better way to die. So she had dressed me up to go to La UCA, the Jesuit university. And we used to go there to talk to Padre Eocuria. Padre Eocuria was a genius. He was one of the Jesuits who was murdered in 1989 in November. And he was from Spain. He was a brilliant intellect. And he would sit and talk with anybody as if we would understand what he was saying. He treated everybody as if they were also a brilliant intellect. And Margarita would tease me. She'd say, "Did you understand what he said?" She said, "He is a genius. No one understands him." So we were in our dresses and little heels walking away from La UCA to her car. And that night, we had an event we were going to. We were in the parking lot. That evening, we'd planned to meet with some of Margarita's friends and a few European journalists who had arrived in the country several weeks earlier. We would listen to reports of what they had seen, and we would tell them what we knew. There would be Coca-Cola and potato chips. We were still in the clothes we had chosen that morning, so yes, we did look bourgeois, but I would never have been able to run in those shoes. I could barely walk in them. Margarita pulled out of the parking lot onto what I would call a slip road, a narrow and unlit road that wound around La UCA. She was still laughing and teasing me when suddenly, and in a grave voice, she said my name, and the car was flooded with light. She pressed the accelerator to the floor. The vehicle behind us was following so closely that a person could have leaped from one roof to the other. Margarita sped into a tunnel of darkness ahead, and the vehicle behind us sped too. "Escuadrón de la Muerte," she said. "It is a death squad, Carolyn. They're going to capture us." I turned around to watch the other car, but couldn't see it for the light. Margarita, I remember calling out, "Can you go faster?" "No, Carolyn, I cannot. This is as fast as I can go, and I think I am lost." "There's the city ahead of us. Drive toward the lights." We sped. The other car sped too. This was going to be it, I thought. Now, when it wasn't expected. After a day of talking about philosophy and God and the practice of liberation, I wanted to be brave. I did not feel brave. I had no weapon. It would not have helped. There was no last chance to do anything over again. "Are you afraid, Margarita?" "Yes." They were still behind us when we reached a heavier trafficked road. Behind us when we got to the roundabout. And that was where the honking began. Other cars whose drivers saw what was happening. Other cars pulling into the roundabout, slowing down, blocking the way of those who followed us, and all the while horns honking and even some cars stopping and people getting out of the cars. And then there was an opening and we took it all the way to the house of the friends of Margarita. We didn't breathe. And then the door was opening and we ran through it from the front of the house to the garden in the back where the journalists were standing in the dark. I found, when I was writing this book, I tried to write it so that the reader would never know more than I knew at the time. So there's no adult, grown-up person. There's no Carolyn as an older woman who's now telling you what I felt and what it meant. There's only that 27-year-old, because I wanted to see if I could replicate on paper the experience that I had, because I was writing it for young people who might themselves go through an experience. I kept notebooks at the time, and I used to kind of disappear into them and write really fast in a pencil. I just wrote as fast as I could, and I didn't punctuate. I don't know why I didn't punctuate, but I discovered these notebooks while I was writing this book, and I read my earlier self on paper in those moments when I was really scared and trying to remember details, and I decided to lift those notebook entries directly into my book, because the language, how weird their language was how it felt to be there at the time. I'll just read maybe one or two of those. On both sides of the road there was smoke. It was blue and still rising when we passed. Although the fields were already black and being burned, everything was burned. They had shot the cattle, yes, even them, and the pigs they had also shot. So they were lying there already bloated, and there was a smell of meat as well as death and a howling that couldn't actually have been heard, but it was there. The wattle in the houses was burned and the corn in the cribs. We didn't stop. We slowed down. The turkey vultures were above us, many also already on the ground. They don't sing, they hiss. Some things we saw through the field glasses, some with naked eyes. We couldn't tell how many people. We didn't know how long it had been. That's all we told them. So I will spare you some of the more. Lena was very funny. There are funny things. And I also didn't always do the right thing. And I always didn't observe very well. So I'll give you a scene where I screwed up things. 2 months later, it was toward the end for me, but I didn't know it. I attended Mass in the Basilica on Sunday, hoping once again to receive communion from Monsignor, to feel the raindrops from his aspergillium on me, even though I hadn't confessed the years I'd been away from the sacraments, and even though I wasn't convinced that I would remain among the faithful. I took photographs of him at the altar, speaking into what appeared to be a telephone held by an altar boy, whom I would meet decades later as a grown man attending school in the United States. Seated to the left of the altar is Father Ignacio Echecuria, arms folded, not wearing his glasses, his eyes appearing to focus on Monsignor's raised hand. After Mass, some young people from the popular organization asked to meet with me in one of the basilica's bell towers. They knelt, bandanas around their necks ready to be pulled over their faces, and whispered that their compañeros were among those in the coffins lined up along the communion rail to be blessed, their faces visible through the windows cut into the coffin lids. I had gone close enough to look at the faces, and they resembled photographs of children asleep. Strands of incense smoke still crawled through the gray air, and rock doves flapped their wings in the stone clerestory. As I left, I noticed a man wearing sunglasses who was inexplicably carrying an attaché case, which is maybe why I took note of him. He paused near one of the side altars as if offering a special prayer. The following day, a priest found an attaché case containing 72 sticks of dynamite behind that side altar. It had been set to detonate during a funeral mass for a civilian member of the junta scheduled for that afternoon, but the detonator had apparently failed. Later, I saw the man in the sunglasses standing in the lobby of the hotel. I went up to him, said hello, introduced myself, and told him that I had seen him at Mass. "You did not see me," he said stiffly, and he excused himself. Lionel was skeptical when I told him the story of the man with the attaché case, because such a man doesn't usually allow himself to be seen. "Describe him again," he said. "You have to give me something more than sunglasses." "He didn't look Salvadoran." "You're telling me what? That he was a gringo?" "I don't know." "Well, you said you spoke with him. Was he a gringo?" "I think so." "You have to do more than think so. You have to be sure." "Can we drop it then?" "I'm not sure." "Mira, Papu, guard your credibility. This is something that cannot be recovered once lost. Remember the rumor that flew around about a young girl with a man's head stuffed into her stomach? Remember that? You know they found her that way. I know they found her that way, but it doesn't sound true. So you can't say it. You can't write it. Even in a poem, if you had a photograph of the goddamn thing, no one would believe you. As for your man in the basilica, your observations are imprecise. Next time, pay closer attention. Someday, you will be talking to your own people, writing for your own people. I promise you that it is going to be difficult to get Americans to believe what is happening here. For one thing, this is outside the realm of their imaginations. For another, it isn't in their interests to believe you. For a third, it is possible that we are not human beings to them. So he says something that I want to share, just a small statement toward the end, because of our condition now. You want to know what is revolutionary, Papu? To tell the truth. That is what you will do when you return to your country. That's all I'm asking of you. From the beginning, this has been your journey, your coming to consciousness. All along, I have only been responding to you. When you ask me a question, I try to place you in a situation in which you might find your answer. I do not have your answers, Papu. I am just a man. I came back, and it was difficult sometimes at first. I was a little bit obsessed with El Salvador and with trying to prevent military intervention, with trying to somehow lessen the military and economic aid that was being given. So now I am back at home in Virginia. My walls were covered with maps. The United States had push pins marking every place I thought I should go. The Isthmus of the Americas had X's every place I had been. There were also photographs tacked to the walls, reports, newspaper clippings, Post-it notes with various reminders, lists of the names of desaparecidos and the dead. A paper war room, a paper cemetery, a paper command and control. When the windows were open, some of these items were lifted from the walls and rocked gently down to the floor. So there were often also papers scattered there as well, or stuffed into boxes and folders. I knew where everything was, I told myself. For the desaparecidos, I kept records of where everyone was last seen and what they were wearing at the time. Friends no longer asked what all of this was for, or what I was doing, and accepted that for a while at least, I would bore the dinner party with the latest news and trivia, such as how one high-ranking American in the Foreign Service was making a fortune airlifting illegally logged mahogany by helicopter out of Honduras. Things like that. One day, and I mention this now because it became important later, I saw a photograph in Newsweek of a photographer lying protectively over another photographer's wounded body in a street under fire. I tore it out and tacked it on the wall, most likely on top of something else. The photograph saddened me, but I thought nothing more about it at the time. Then another photographer sent word asking if I would write a text for a book of photographs taken in El Salvador by 30 photographers from the United States and Europe. They had a text by a French writer already, but it decided it wouldn't work. It was too flowery, too something, and Harry didn't like it, they said. When we talked about what sort of text it should be, every time I made a suggestion, the response was, we'll have to check with Harry and get back to you. Harry was in Beirut. Harry was in Paris. We'll get back to you. There was no Harry. Okay, so Harry, now I've been married to Harry for 35 years, so I gave you that, but it was just to give you a sense of how I was feeling. It isn't the risk of death and fear of danger that prevent people from rising up, Lionel once said. It is numbness, acquiescence, and the defeat of the mind. Resistance to oppression begins when people realize deeply within themselves that something better is possible. He also said that what destroys a society, a state, a government is corruption. That and the use of force, which is always applied against those who have not been convinced or included. He was always talking about corruption, trying to prevent it, to expose it, to eradicate it. He was dedicated to bringing the sin to the eye. Over the years, I've been asked why, as a 27-year-old American poet who spoke Spanish brokenly and knew nothing about the Isthmus of the Americas, I would accept the invitation of a man I barely knew to spend time in a country on the verge of war. And why would this stranger, said to be a lone wolf, a communist, a CIA operative, a world-class marksman, and a small-time coffee farmer, take any interest in a naive North American poet? As one man put it, what does poetry have to do with anything? We reached the chosen place and opened the box, and before digging my hands into his remains, I asked him quietly within myself if I might tell the story now, everything, or almost everything. Of course, he bellows, write, and do not waste time. Why do you think I brought you to Salvador in the first place? So you could eat papayas? You're a goddamn poet, Papu, you must write. People ask me now what it was like to work with him in the early days before the war. Some still want to know who he really was, of course, but that is now becoming apparent to friends and also to enemies, as he knew it might one day. This is what I tell people now. It was as if he had stood me squarely before the world, removed the blindfold, and ordered me to open my eyes. Okay, thank you. Do we have some time?
Thank you for your reading so much. And as a poet myself, I'm thinking a lot about witnessing and what it means to witness. And so I was hoping maybe you could just give kind of what it means to you to witness, and particularly witness through poetry. And I'm particularly moved, I think, by your accounts not only of, corruption and atrocity, but also of the brave and loving acts that happen in the face of that. So the cars that come in and disrupt a car chase, right? Or a photographer who protectively acts towards another photographer, or, so what does it mean to witness? What are you witnessing?
This story is the story of the story of a North American who is brought to a country and given an incredible education by the people there. And everyone was in danger, and everyone was afraid. And I saw a lot of horrible things, but I also met the most beautiful souls I've ever known, who were willing to give their lives for each other, and who were generous of spirit and kind. And so the book has filled with them too. And what I believe witness is it's the writing that you do in the aftermath of what you experience. You go through experiences, your language also passes through them. If they are experiences of extremity, of suffering, your language is marked by that suffering. The only thing you can write is what comes from you, from the depths of your own being and soul. It's not like reportage, where someone pretends to be objective and goes to a place they don't know much about, and they encapsulate what's going on there and report back. It's a different thing. I'm talking about writing the wound, and so you do that in your own environment. You do that out of the things that happen to you and the things that that you're marked by in your life. So I don't believe there's such a thing as a poet of witness. I think there's poetry of witness. It's not an identity. It's something that one does in the aftermath. I don't believe we get over things. I don't believe that we come to closure. I think we live in the debris field of whatever has happened. We go on, and we do that for others. And that's a different experience for everyone. And there's a lot of extremity in the United States. Extremity of poverty, racism, misogyny, homophobia, all of that. So the poets that I'm most interested in reading right now are the poets who emerge from those communities. Their work is on fire with it. So I read for that. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. This is just incredible. I read the book and just listening to you, it's what else do you want, right? It's the voice has a body, right? And a body has a voice. And my question is about this notion that came in, after World War II, and Adorno said it, and you're pretty sure you know it, but you work on that. You already said it. You work on the wound, on the debris field, right? That to write poetry after Auschwitz will be barbaric. Like to write poetry after every of this man-made craziness is not barbaric. It's just necessary. And then I just say thank you. I know how hard it could be. I cannot imagine how hard it could be to go back and to live through probably wonderful but also very dark moments. And but I wanted you to answer as a poet to that epitaph that had probably hold many voices to be brave, powerful like you to do it again.
Well, on the subject of Adorno's dictum to write poetry after the Holocaust is barbaric, he was condemning all documents of a civilization that would perpetrate the Holocaust. So, he later said, maybe I shouldn't have said that it was barbaric to write poetry, because he didn't mean just poetry. He meant you have to acknowledge that all things produced by a civilization that will produce genocide have to be considered the products of barbarity, you see. So it's a difficult idea to get around, but people struggled with him. Edmund Jabez and others struggled with this dictum, what do you mean by it? And when he really had to account for it, he kind of backtracked a little bit and said, well, you have to write. And what Paul Celan said was, we will write, we will not write as we did before. So that is what, and he did that Paul Celan gave a speech at Bremen in 1958, in which that is made very clear. So I don't know what the efficacy of poetry is, but I know it touches hearts, and I know that I was able to talk to a lot of people about the situation in El Salvador through poetry, which astonishes me, because it means Lionel was right. As crazy as it seemed at the time to have a poet, come at that moment. But he had a lot of crazy ideas. I wasn't his only craziness. I was just one of his crazinesses. But I'm glad he educated me, and I'm glad for every second of my time with him and with them, because I was completely changed by it, irrevocably. So I don't know what would have happened if I hadn't answered the door. I mean, so answer the door. That's the thing I want to say, especially to the young people here. Answer the door. It's okay. What else? Yes.
I don't know. My English is not very well, but according what I understood, you were a witness of the man who entered at the church with the glasses in the attaché. Is that right?
Yes.
Did you get later or during or after the agreement of peace?
Yeah.
Some testimony about that?
At the time, I told the Church Human Rights Office, I told Leonel, I told everybody who would listen, that man was not Salvadoran. I don't know what he was. I had an idea, but I really don't know, and I couldn't describe him well enough, and so I don't know that anything ever came of that, and I don't know why such a person who was not Salvadoran would do something like that. Leonel, as I said, was skeptical, but it was him. Those glasses had mirrors on them. That's how I remembered it. They were kind of bluish and had mirrors. And he was not happy that I had recognized him, and came up to him. That's why I thought, it was the guy who had the attaché case. And then how coincidental that they find an attaché case, behind that altar. So I believed that he placed it there. But I didn't have I told everybody. I don't know what happened with that piece of information.
No, that's the first time I heard that kind of testimony.
Do you remember that incident?
I was working at that time in a factory, and I've been reading more and knowing a little more our Saint Archbishop Romero.
Yes.
Now,
right.
Because while he was during the Mass every Sunday,
yes,
I was catechism
Oh, you
in
were
another church at that time. But I met him. We had a meeting with him and talking about the
situation,
danger he was facing from the death squad at that time. And some other, before I forget, did you get some pictures or in the jail you visit in Aguachapan?
I had no camera and we had no cell phones, no pictures inside. That Aguachapan jail, I was told later, was turned into a military barracks of some kind. And I've just asked the people who are going to try to find out whether it's still a military barracks and whether that building still exists, But that's what I was told, that they ended it as a prison. And not long after I was there, it was pretty early in the war. I guess they wanted to have soldiers there. So I don't know what they did with the prisoners, but they changed it.
What year did you stay there?
78, 79, early 80. And Monsignor Romero asked me to leave on March 16th. So it was a week before he was killed. And both Leonel and Monsignor said that it was time for me to go and that I didn't have any choice about it. But I argued with Monsignor and I'm sorry about that, but I tried to ask him to leave also, or to let me stay just 2 more weeks, because I just had a little bit more work to do, and then I would go. And he said, no, your time is up. You have to go now. And he said, my place is with my people. I'm not leaving. And your place is with yours. So that was the last time I saw him. A week later, I got a phone call. The day after he was killed, the U.S. Congress Subcommittee on Inter-American Relations approved the first advisors to go to El Salvador and approved the restoration of military aid with the first 5.5 million, I believe. I was in the room when they voted to do it the day after the assassination. So I was learning much more about my own country than I even had learned about El Salvador.
I appreciate your
I
support.
appreciate you too, and your English
memories.
is good. Your English is good.
Thank you very much.
Welcome. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.